As we close up the discussion of World War II, it's important to focus on a couple of notable features of the conflict. Last time we covered the resistance movements in Europe, perhaps the most famous resistance movements, but let's remember that in the United States during the same period there was ongoing deportation on trains of an ethnic minority group, specifically Mexican Americans. So some of the images of moving minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, on trains, across borders, deporting people who are deemed to be of not proper citizenship status was something that was going on in the United States as well. Additionally, the United States built concentration camps. Now, concentration camps have various types, but there are essentially any camp that concentrates a population, be they immigrants, war refugees, or some civilian population, some designated outgroups, so forth, into a space, that's a concentration camp. So a prison for immigrants, for example, where they're concentrated in a small space, according to a textbook and historian definition, that's a concentration camp. For internment camps for the Japanese, I put that in quotes because those are concentration camps as well. It's considered function of the citizenship and ethnic status of Japanese American populations. The imprisonment and detainment of Japanese, called internment because it was for an indefinite period of time, and Japanese Americans in the United States of America during World War II was the forced relocation, packing people, forcing them to move on trains, and incarceration in concentration camps in the western interior of the country of between 110,000 and 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry who were U.S. citizens. Most of these individuals were living on the Pacific coast. 62% of the internees were officially U.S. citizens. Some had been petitioning for citizenship, and then others were simply long-term immigrants. These actions were ordered in part by the Roosevelt administration, although the link here is a little bit ambiguous. So Roosevelt himself did not actually create these concentration camps. The U.S. military did. The U.S. military did it as part of a bipartisan effort with backings from war hawks in the Democratic and Republican parties. What President Roosevelt did was he gave the power to the U.S. military to create U.S. military zones within the United States as a measure of national security using an executive order. Japanese Americans were then incarcerated based on local population concentrations by order of the U.S. military. In Hawaii, however, where Hawaii was a territory, not a state, and there were 150,000 plus Japanese Americans, both Issei and Nisei, first and second generation, and they composed over 1/3 of the population, there were only 1,000 to about 2,000 that were interred. The imprisonment was considered to be a result more really retrospectively. This was more about racism than a security risk posed by Japanese Americans. There's no evidence that Japanese Americans really had any loyalty to the Japanese Empire. Those were as little as 1/16 Japanese could also be forcibly interred. This is a map of the Japanese internment. Here you see the lines of the exclusion area, which was going to prohibit any Japanese or Japanese Americans from living in this exclusion area, and then force them to relocate into military camps and districts either within or outside that area, including Camp Livingston, which is in northeastern Louisiana, as well as Jerome, Roher, and then there was also Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, the only camp east of the Mississippi. Now, notably, there was also popular effort spurred on by artists individuals like Dr. Seuss, who drew up wartime propaganda, created these racist images of Japanese to support this effort. So here this comes from the Library of Congress, but it says, maybe only alley cats, but jeepers, a hell of a lot of them, a sort of personification of people as animals, and then using the slur here on the signpost to name the alley, a racist term there. Now, you might feel a little bit disenchanted by this portrayal of Dr. Seuss, but Dr. Seuss would later go on to write an apology in the form of the book Horton Hears a Who, which is a very Seussian apology because the message is everybody's voice is important no matter how small is the refrain. Then later the U.S. government would formally apologize for the internment of American citizens. In 1980, under mounting pressure from the Japanese American Citizens League and other redress organizations, President Jimmy Carter opened an investigation to determine whether there should be a decision to put some sort of effort into giving remittances or some sort of compensation to Japanese American families. He opened the investigation into the argument over whether or not the decision to put Japanese Americans into internment camps had been justified properly by the government. He appointed the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians to investigate the concentration camps and their records. The Commission's report, titled Personal Justice Denied, found little evidence of Japanese disloyalty, and Japanese American disloyalty was totally nil at the time, and the report concluded that incarceration had been the product of racism. This was an official congressional report. It also recommended that the government pay reparations to the internees. Then, as per those bipartisan recommendations, finally, in 1988, President Ronald Reagan was pushed to sign into law the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which apologized officially for the internment on behalf of the U.S. government and authorized a payment of $20,000 US, equivalent to roughly $40,000 in 2017, to give you a little bit more perspective, to each camp survivor. If the camp survivors then had relatives that needed to collect the reparations, that was possible in some cases, but in most cases, if individuals had died afterwards, then their families did not receive reparations. The legislation admitted that the government actions were based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, direct quote. The U.S. government eventually dispersed more than $1.6 billion US, or $3.3 billion US, in reparations to 80,000 Japanese Americans who had been interned and some of their heirs, as some of them had died in the process. So, moving forward, keep this example in mind, as is often cited as a textbook example of how reparations might be used in accordance with American law. Now, of course, most wars historically have come to an end. There are some that have just sort of trailed on, but World War II came to an end. In the Pacific Theater, American forces, accompanied by the forces of the Philippine Commonwealth, advanced in the Philippines, clearing late at the end of April of 1945. They ended and landed their efforts in Luzon in January of 1945, recapturing Manila in March, following a battle which reduced the city to ruins. Fighting continued on Luzon and Mindanao and other islands in the Philippines until the end of the Second World War. Meanwhile, the United States Army and Air Forces were destroying strategic and populated cities and towns in Japan in an effort to destroy Japanese war industry and civilian morale. On the night of the 9th and 10th of March, U.S. Air Force B-29 bombers struck Tokyo with thousands of incendiary bombs, which killed 100,000 civilians and destroyed 16 square miles of the city within a few hours. Absolute war crime by all accounts. Over the next 5 months, the U.S. Air Force firebombed a total of 67 Japanese cities, killing nearly 400,000 civilians and destroying 65% of the landscape of built-up areas, with the racist rhetoric of the American politicians backing these actions. In May of 1945, Australian troops landed in Borneo, in what is now Indonesia, overrunning the oil fields there. British, American, and Chinese forces then defeated Japanese forces in northern Burma and Myanmar now in March of 1945, and British forces then pushed on to reach Rangoon by the 3rd of May. British forces here are, of course, substantially personneled by South Asian and, in the case of Myanmar, Southeast Asian people. Chinese forces started to counterattack in the Battle of West Hunan that occurred in April and June of 1945, and then American naval and amphibious forces also moved towards Japan, taking Iwo Jima by March, Okinawa by the end of June, and at the same time American submarines cut off Japanese imports, drastically reducing the Japanese Empire's ability to supply its overseas forces. The Allies called for an unconditional Japanese imperial surrender in the Potsdam Declaration on the 27th of July, but Japanese government's officials rejected the call. In early August, the U.S. Air Force then bombed atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, neglecting information that, in fact, Japan was already negotiating or planning to negotiate a surrender. In fact, between the two bombings, the Soviets, pursuant to the Yalta Agreement, invaded Japanese-held Manchuria and quickly defeated the Kwantung Army, which was the largest of the Japanese fighting forces. The Red Army also captured Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands, and on August 15th of 1945, the Japanese Empire surrendered, with their surrender documents finally signed at Tokyo Bay on the deck of the American war battleship, the USS Missouri, on September 2nd of 1945, officially ending World War II in the Pacific. However, it is notable that several high-up officials in the U.S. military later indicated that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were completely unjustified. In fact, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stated in a public address at the Washington Monument 2 months after the bombings, quote, "The atomic bomb played no decisive part from a purely military standpoint in the defeat of Japan." Admiral William Bull Halsey, Jr., commander of the U.S. Third Fleet, stated publicly in 1946 that, quote, "The first atomic bomb was an unnecessary experiment." The first one. It was a mistake to even drop it. He blames the scientists on this, but of course there were military commanders involved. He says they had this toy and they wanted to try it out, so they dropped it. General Dwight Eisenhower, later president, for his part, stated in his memoirs that when notified by Secretary of War Henry Stimson on the decision to use atomic weapons, he, quote, "voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and the dropping of the bomb was completely unnecessary, and second because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives." He later even publicly declared it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. Even the famous Hawk general, Major General Curtis LeMay, head of the 21st Bomber Command, went public a month after the bombing, telling the press that, quote, the atomic bomb had nothing to do with the end of the war at all. So the question then begins to emerge. If the war was won before Hiroshima and the generals who dropped the bomb knew it, why was the bomb dropped and what was the point? The implication, of course, emerges at the Paris Peace Treaties of 1947. If the conditions theoretically, of course we can't answer this question, but theoretically, if the conditions had continued as expected, there would have been bilateral negotiations with the Soviet Union and Japan. Instead, with the dropping of the atomic bombs, there were bilateral negotiations with Japan and the United States. Then, at the Paris Peace Treaties, the Traité de Paris, which were signed on the 10th of February of 1947 as an outcome of the Paris Peace Conference held from July 29th to October 15th of 1946, the victorious Allied command powers, principally the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, States, negotiated the details of peace treaties with Italy and the minor Axis powers, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Finland, and so forth, following the end of World War II in 1945, therefore ending the war. The garden that you see in the background here is the garden, the Paris Peace Garden, at the location of the conference, which was designed by the Japanese-American activist Isamu Noguchi, who is in fact a famous sculptor as well as landscape designer. Isamu Noguchi was also famous for volunteering to enter the concentration camps in the United States as a part of his protest against the treatment of Japanese Americans. So quite significant that he was awarded the design of this garden, which can still be found in Paris today. For your discussion post, I'd like you to start 3 threads. Again, you only have to contribute to one of the threads, but let's have 3 separate ones going. So if you're replying to somebody who has replied to one of these questions, make that a direct reply. First thread should be, how would you compare the presentation of World War II history in Corbett et al., that is the OpenStax textbook, with the material that we have discussed this week in these lecture slides and voiceover slides, sort of podcast-like format? Second, how would you compare the material with the material that you knew about World War II previously? What was new? What was not new? Why? And then third, if you had to pick one key narrative about World War II, which narrative would you argue is the most important and why? Go ahead and brainstorm to yourself for 3 minutes or so, draft something out, just a short sentence or 2, and then respond to one of the threads, and let's keep the discussion going.